Hey, I'm Noam Weissman, and you're listening to Unpacking Israeli History, the podcast that takes a deep dive into some of the most intense, historically fascinating, and often misunderstood events and stories linked to Israeli history. This week's episode is sponsored by dear friends and supporters, Marcy and Andrew Spitzer. Before we start, as always, my email, noam@jewishnpack.com. Okay, yalla, let's do this. As you know, because I asked about it in every episode, I love to hear from you. Sometimes y'all send thoughtful critiques about episodes, which I love. Sometimes you send ideas for episodes, also, which I love. Sometimes you send questions, which is so great, I love it. And this week's episode is our first official, ready for the name, Israel Open Mic. We've taken some of the really interesting and inspired questions that I've received, and this episode will be like 5 or so mini episodes all in one, addressing them. Now, let's be realistic. We're not going to be able to do in 5 to 10 minutes what we would be able to do in a full episode, which is really break down the story and give the larger context and understand what the story is and why it's important. But I still think there's a value, like a real value, in being able to understand stories, at least in a small way. And then you know what? Maybe one day we'll be able to do larger, fuller episodes about these topics. So a few weeks ago, we actually recruited questions from you listeners. They're great. And you all actually really delivered, and we got tons of questions. Like, I was going to say hundreds, it wasn't hundreds, like dozens of questions. Really great questions. In fact, you delivered so well that we aren't going to be able to get through all the questions that you all sent in. We're only going to be able to get into a few of the questions in this episode. Don't fret. We're going to do more of these episodes, so please, whenever you're listening to this, don't be shy. You know what I'm going to say. Send me an email, noam@jewishnpack.com. Okay, with that, let's get into it. Okay, first question. We got this question from Steven. Steven said this. Hi, Noam. I very much enjoy your podcast. It has been a very difficult year, as you have so eloquently articulated. Some of the more troubling things to see are Jewish factions who are anti-Israel, even to the level of marching with Muslim fundamentalists. I was hoping you might be able to explain the various reasons for this hateful opposition to the legitimacy of Israel amongst these religious and secular Jews. Thanks in advance. Best wishes, Stephen. Stephen, I really appreciated this question. Not because it brought me joy. I wasn't like, yay. In fact, it made me pretty sad, actually. But I liked it because it gave me an opportunity to do something I try to do whenever I can, which is to practice empathy without a writer, without like any preconditions. Put myself in another person's shoes and try to understand them for real. See it from their position. To say, these guys are idiots, screw them. But really ask myself, there are actually plenty of Jews who proudly call themselves anti-Israel. So here's my tall order. In just a few minutes, I want to try to understand this phenomenon. We could basically divide the anti-Zionist Jews into 2 major camps. Before I divide it into 2 major camps, I want to just throw out a broader statistic, which is somewhere between 90 to 95% of Jews across the world have a positive attachment towards Israel. They think that the state of Israel should exist. 46% of world Jewry lives in Israel. Around 40 to 45% of world Jewry lives in America. And within that 40 to 45% of the world Jewry that lives in America, something like 80% or so of these Jewish people have either an attachment to Israel or they think that the state of Israel should exist. But let's understand the camps of the Jewish people who are not supportive of Israel. Let's understand this. The first is left-wing Jews, in quotes, and the second is ultra-Orthodox Jews, also in quotes. And by the way, I hate the term ultra-Orthodox, is not my favorite. I like the Hebrew term Haredi. A lot of people don't know what it means, so we just say ultra-Orthodox. But let's start on the left. Let's start with the left wing. And I always find this fascinating because you wouldn't think that the ultra-Orthodox and left-wing Jews can align on ideology as it relates to Israel, but there's something called the horseshoe theory. It's like this, the horseshoe, where basically extremes on both sides end up like this, you go, if you see me, it's like this, like they have a horseshoe and they come together with the same opinions on the extremes. It's fascinating. Pay attention to it in politics in general. And it's also the case with the Jewish world. So let's start with the left wing, which I think we can subdivide again into 2 groups. Group 1 is genuinely convinced by the arguments that Israel oppresses Palestinians. They've seen devastating news clips and they're feeling complicit in something they really see as awful. I talked about this group in the meta-narratives episode we released in the weeks after the 7th of October, 10/7, 7/10, depending on where you're from. I don't see these people as evil. I'm actually going to play a clip from that episode here.
Let's steelman this. Let's try to understand why they've adopted the narrative that they have. Here it is. Despite their seeming support for Hamas, most young people are very anti-Nazi, right? So we'll use World War II as an example. Imagine it's 1945. For 48 hours straight, US and British air forces pound the German city of Dresden with 4,000 tons of high explosive bombs. In 2 days, they killed 25,000 civilians and destroyed acres of historically and culturally priceless art and architecture. Now imagine the whole thing is uploaded to TikTok. You're 20 years old and glued to your phone. You see the crying babies, the maimed civilians, the newly homeless sifting through the rubble for a sign of life. Share after share after share, the outrage goes viral. How could the Americans do this? How could they kill so many people in cold blood? As the 30-second clips make the rounds, no one bothers to ask if they actually show Dresden, or if they're showing Tokyo, or Yemen, or Syria. Okay, I'm getting a little anachronistic here, I know, but you see my point. Okay, yes, sure, some of these videos are mislabeled from years ago or from hundreds of miles away, but some are real. And you're watching these gut-wrenching images of dead kids, of destroyed houses, of men in tanks with machine guns. I'm watching it. And you're a good person. You're on the side of the little guy, of humanity, of kids not dying. And maybe you also don't know so much about this conflict. And I say this without making fun or being derogatory. But you may have an underdeveloped, reductive understanding of this entire conflict to begin with. The Israelis are white. The Palestinians are brown. There's oil in Gaza. These are outright falsehoods peddled as truth, all manufactured to fit a very simple narrative in line with a specific worldview. And college kids are falling for it hook, line, and sinker. Listen, if you're at Columbia or York or University of Sydney, you're probably familiar with what your government did to Indigenous Americans or Canadians or Australians. You know all about the history of slavery and race relations in your home country. You're ashamed of this profound moral stain on your history, as you should be. But here's the fatal flaw. Here's the thing that makes many of us extra susceptible to misinformation. What happens is we view every country through that same narrow lens. We end up having no understanding of the fact that most conflicts can't be shoehorned into our established narrative. Since you were a kid, you've seen Israeli bulldozers destroying houses, or thousands of Palestinians in Israeli jails, or Israeli tanks rolling into the West Bank. You don't know anything about how Israel got there, or why it built a fence, or what it offered during multiple peace negotiations, or why it sends teenage soldiers into Jenin. And if I sound like I'm mocking you or mocking college kids, I promise I'm not. I'm saying that it's very possible they just don't know. And attempts to change their minds aren't going to work unless they're open to acknowledging that. As one college student at Princeton told me, students are much more interested in having an opinion and then finding supporting facts than learning the history and making up their minds.
I think they are misguided, guided only by one aspect of their Jewish identity, a universalist impulse, which is deeply holy and part of the Jewish story, but without a desire to understand and protect their own people, without being protective and defensive. I think it's missing something. Group 2, which has a lot of overlap, left-wing Jews who want to fit in amongst their left-wing peers, and distancing themselves from Israel is a way to do that. I actually had an episode where we talked about this in another podcast, Wandering Jews, which I co-host with Michal Biton. You got to check it out. In that episode, which was about the college encampments, we talked about how hard it is to be socially ostracized from the people you thought were your friends. It's really hard, and how easy it is to feign certainty in an attempt to be kept in the group. And I actually think my co-host Michal, she said it perfectly here. Check it out.
There's push and pull, right? There's the pull of the be part of a community, be part of like the right side of history, go up against like evil imperialism in America and Israel. There's also like the factors that is like, if you don't join us, you might actually pay a price. If you're the only one in like a group of friends that when you're walking by and they're like, hey, come over, you're like, I don't think so. You will pay a social price. And that is really hard to resist.
What I find so fascinating is that the opposite of fitting in is actually belonging. And that's really hard to do, to belong. And people struggle with that. And instead of trying to belong, they try to fit in. Listen, I disagree with these groups who reject Israel, but I want to engage with them. I want to learn with them. I want to think with them. I don't want to throw them out. I want to say to these people, and I hope many of them are listening, forget indoctrination on any side. Forget it. Choose education. Read the books. Listen to the podcast. Learn Jewish history broadly, the broad story. Engage in the Jewish story broadly. Speak to people on different sides, including Israelis and Palestinians of all stripes. Just try to learn with an open mind. And now the second camp, the ultra-Orthodox Jews, the Haredi Jews, who are anti-Israel in a completely different way than their left-wing Jewish brothers and sisters. Their basic argument would come down to religion. And again, there are two reasons for this. But before that, a story. Story time. I was once at an Israeli Day Parade rally when I was probably 21 or so, and there was a girl I was flirting with a lot. So we're strolling down Fifth Avenue, and these Neturei Karta folks, check out our Unpacked YouTube channel for more on them. Just type in Unpacked, Neturei Karta, you'll find it on YouTube. They were yelling nasty things about Israel, really mean things. And I just unleashed on them a curse, probably made fun of their moms, bad stuff, not a good look. But this 19-year-old girl thought I was kind of crazy, like the kind of crazy that she liked. And she ended up marrying me. And so it all turned out well for me. Ooh, it's amazing. Anyway, I'm digressing. It's kind of like this. For the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredi world, who is 99% of the time not Neturei Karta, who are actually just extremists garbed in ostensibly Jewish clothing, Zionism, at least political Zionism, is basically a secular movement packed with non-Jewish influences. So again, Neturei Karta, 99% of the Haredi world is not the Neturei Karta. I want to understand the ultra-Orthodox opposition to Israel. Here's the deal. They view Zionism as lacking key features like Mashiach, the Messiah, and the rebuilt temple. European Zionism in the 1800s was actually born amidst a culture clash between enlightened secular Jews and traditional religious Jews. In the European Ashkenazi world, the religious were often horrified that secular Jews would violate Torah in the place where mitzvot, the Torah commandments, count the most, which is the land of Israel, Eretz Israel. And a lot of that suspicion and alienation has stuck with the Haredi Jewish communities of Israel. The second reason is even more explicitly religious, almost like theological. And I used to teach this, and I love teaching this. The Talmud, one of our key central Jewish texts, and in the Tractate Ketubot, page 111a, and I actually know that by heart, okay? It shares a rabbinic story of 3 oaths that God makes. The first is that Israel would not go up like a wall, meaning they wouldn't conquer the land of Israel by massive force. The second is that God made Israel swear that they would not rebel against the nations of the world, i.e. they would obey the governments in exile. And third, God made the non-Jews swear not to oppress Israel too much. Again, too much is in quotes. It's a translation of the phrase yoter midai, but let's go with it. So those are 3 oaths or things that were sworn a few thousand years ago, says the Talmud. Again, I cannot say this enough. I am oversimplifying, but I am explaining something. Like I said, for years, I taught a whole semester's class on the Haredi opposition to Zionism and then religious defenses of Zionism in reaction to the Haredi opposition. But the traditional Haredi understanding of the story of the 3 oaths goes something like this. These oaths are binding upon the people of Israel, and therefore, goes the argument, the Jewish people are commanded not to control the land of Israel unless God miraculously gives it over. So the fact that Israel holds political sovereignty of the land makes it treif, meaning not kosher in their eyes. The Satmar Hasidim are probably the most famous example of this. Satmar are anti-Zionists. They don't love the concept of the state of Israel. They believe that Jewish people should be required to wait for the Messiah before they return to the Holy Land. Again, this is a major generalization, but I'm just trying to answer Steve's question in an empathetic and honest way. By the way, I should add, though the Haredi community still doesn't consider itself Zionist, most Haredim today are probably more accurately classified as non-Zionist rather than anti-Zionist. It's actually fascinating. What's happened over the years is that many young Haredim in Israel are nationalistic, even if they don't identify as Zionist. But the Haredim feel attached to the Jewish people, to doing so much goodness and kindness for the Jewish people. So things are not that simple. Unless it's the Neturei Karta, and then I'm kind of like, get out of here. My empathy has lines. So Steve, I hope that helps answer your question. Again, would love to do a full episode on this one day, so stay tuned. And now let's get to the next question. Here it is. This question came from Amir. Amir shared this with us, so let's just play it.
I have a question for you that came out of the episode you did on Iran. This sort of brought back some memories from my childhood in the 1980s when I remember the whole Iran-Contra affair was raging, and I barely understood it at the time, but I had some recollection that Israel was involved in transferring weapons to Iran on behalf of the U.S., and it sort of brings to mind the whole enemy of my enemies, or I don't even understand exactly how this came about, but I thought it would be a nice question for you to address either in a Q&A session or in a dedicated episode. But that's it. That's my question. Would love to get your insight on that.
Amir, I'm right with you, buddy. I was literally a baby during the Iran-Contra affair, and I definitely want to do a full episode on this because the relationship between Israel and Iran is a wild one. But again, let's see what we can do in only a few minutes here. As I talked about in the Hezbollah episode, Israel and Iran had a pretty cozy relationship before the Iranian Revolution of 1979. Bet you didn't know that. We're talking a significant Israeli expat community and daily flights between Tehran and Tel Aviv. Wild, right? That would be awesome now. If you want to know more about the Iranian Revolution, check out our Hezbollah episode. But for our purposes, you have to know that after the revolution, everything changed. And Israel and Iran have had a fairly bad relationship since then. I'm recording this now in November 2024, and in the last month, Israel and Iran have traded missiles. Not to mention Iran has been funding Hamas and Hezbollah for decades, and the Houthis. So not great stuff. But Amir, you asked about the Iran-Contra affair. So let's get into that because it's actually bonkers. In 1980, the Iran-Iraq War broke out. Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Iran, aiming to seize Iranian oil fields and prevent the spread of Iran's Islamic Revolution. Israel viewed Iraq as a primary threat, as Iraq had openly called for the destruction of Israel and was a significant military power in the region. So because Iraq was the bigger threat, secretly, Israel began to kind of work with Iran. Geez, feels like Israel is that kid begging its neighbors to just be friends, let's be friends. So during the Iran-Iraq War, 1980 to 1988, Israel engaged in secret arms sales and military instruction to Iran, despite Iran's official stance of hostility towards Israel. Israel's actions violated U.S. policy, which stated that no arms be sent to Iran until the release of American hostages at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. In 1985, yes, the year I was born, the arms trade took on a new layer when the United States became involved in the infamous Iran-Contra affair. Now, you might have heard of this, but be real. If you're like 95% of people under the age of 40, you're like, I have no idea what it is. Check that, it's 99%. So let me tell you. The Iran-Contra affair involved covert U.S. arms sales to Iran against official U.S. policy, facilitated in part by Israel in an attempt to secure the release of American hostages held by Hezbollah in Lebanon and to fund Contra rebels fighting the socialist government in Nicaragua. Whew, mouthful, right? But basically, Israel, among others, helped the U.S. illegally sell arms to Iran. So why? Great question. Thanks for asking. Here are a few reasons, and again, this is so much. We really may need to do a full episode about this. Maybe. Let's think about it. But here are some reasons. Number one, the common enemy, Iraq. Israel saw Iran as a counterbalance to Iraq, which posed a significant threat to Israeli security due to its military buildup and frequent threats towards Israel. Number dos, Spanish for two. You scratch my back, I scratch yours. Remember the Osirak reactor? We have an episode about it, link in the show notes. But basically, in 1981, Israel launched a surprise attack on Iraq's Osirak nuclear reactor, and Iranian intelligence had helped Israel make that happen. Number three, Israel had lost the relationship with Iran with the overthrow of the Shah of 1979. But with participation in the Iran-Contra affair, Israel hoped to win the favor of quote-unquote moderates in the Iranian regime who would potentially take power after Ayatollah Khomeini's death and steer Iran toward better relations with Israel. Number four, this is a simple one. Israel needed more business, specifically business for the Israeli weapons industry, and Iran was a willing customer. And number five, Israel and the larger Jewish community was trying to help Persian Jews who wanted to immigrate from Iran to the US or Israel, and cooperating with Iran was a good way to make that happen. So Amir, this was helpful. Israel and Iran did work together in the Iran-Contra affair. Pretty interesting story, right? Next question. This came from Sarah. Sarah asked a question I think many of us relate to, and there's no way we'll be able to do this one justice. But let's try. This is Sarah's question.
Hi, my name is Sarah. I live in Gush Etzion, as you can see by the famous tree behind me. And my question is, why did Israel not know what was coming? How is it possible, with all the intelligence that we have, that they didn't see this coming? This question haunts me. And secondly, Why did it take the army so long to get there? That is another question that I just can't wrap my head around. We keep asking and people keep saying answers that don't make sense to me. So please answer these questions for me. Why didn't they see this coming? And why didn't they show up right away when I started getting emergency calls? Thank you.
Okay, this question is kind of impossible, Sarah, but I want to give a warning. Please don't just jump into conspiracy theory land. Before 10/7 or 7/10, October 7th, people were obsessed with 9/11 conspiracy theories, right? We know about these. Here's what people do. I love trying to think about how conspiracy theories work. This is why they go down the rabbit hole. They will give you reasons, sure, bad reasons, which are often grounded in poor evidence, which has been refuted. The danger of conspiracy theories is that people have access to the evidence that undermines their theories. And all of us, to a degree, are on a spectrum of having certain irrational beliefs, but conspiracy theorists believe in their theory in the face of clear evidence. That's what makes it so dangerous. And people who believe in conspiracy theories are not necessarily crazy. People who are not crazy can think crazy things. Why do they believe irrational things? I don't know. Narcissism, paranoia, mental illness. Well, let me tell you this. Cass Sunstein talked about something which I think is interesting. It's when you're informationally isolated. It's when you have a crippled epistemology. But what's puzzling is someone who lives in London or New York who has access to information. I think for a lot of us, there is a lack of information because we struggle with living in a world we cannot explain. We give reasons to allow us to sleep better. Oh, there's dissonance. My mind can't make sense of what happened. Well, Bibi must have wanted it. I will politely ask my audience to aim higher. The truth is that from a practical perspective, there still hasn't been a military inquiry. Over a year after the 7th of October attack, Israel's still waiting for an official state inquiry of what went wrong leading up to the 7th of October and on the day itself. Many Israelis are pretty angry about this, and I get it. But I'll give it a shot because we do know some things, and here's what we do know and what could have led to all of this. Number one, the Concepcia. If you're a regular listener, you've heard the term the Concepcia before. Rewind back to 1973, the Yom Kippur War, when Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year for the Jewish people. The post-war Argonaut Commission of Inquiry investigated not just the operational surprise, but the conceptual failure, which became known as the Concepcia, which was the governing assumption or maybe arrogance that convinced key Israeli military figures that Egypt would be unable to engage in the necessary deep penetration bombing of Israel, that they wouldn't start a war that it couldn't win. Almost 50 years on to the day, Israel made serious conceptual mistakes in the lead up to the Hamas attack, like a Concepcia Part 2. People just didn't believe Hamas could pull something off quite like this. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, this one's really hard to say, but the Israeli government indirectly propped up Hamas's rule in Gaza in several ways. First, Netanyahu allowed Qatari money, which is suitcases full of cash, to flow into Gaza on the mistaken understanding that money and power maybe would moderate Hamas leaders to focus on, the internal infrastructure of Gaza. He and other Israeli political leaders were also convinced, this is also part of it, that a strong Hamas meant the Palestinian leadership was divided, which reduced the pressure on Israel for a two-state solution, and it was almost like a three-state solution. Okay, number three, Israel's reliance on technology. After all of Hamas's tunnel digging in the 2010s, the Israeli government invested billions in building an underground wall between Israel and Gaza, which went as deep as 160 feet in some places. Combined with an electronic fence and sophisticated technological equipment, the government basically got cocky and decided that the border was impenetrable, kind of like 1973, the Bar-Lev line. Soldiers guarding the border were redeployed to other areas like the West Bank. In fact, Amir Tibon, a Haaretz reporter and survivor of October 7th, wrote that on October 7th, 2023, there were 25 battalions in the West Bank and fewer than 600 soldiers along the Gaza border. That's a mistake. And number four, missed intelligence. This is another tragic one. More than a year before the 7th of October, Israeli officials obtained Hamas's battle plan. I'll say it again. More than a year before the 7th of October, Israeli officials had Hamas's battle plan. That's a fact. But Israeli military and intelligence officials dismissed the plan as aspirational. They wouldn't do it. They just thought Hamas couldn't really pull it off. Wouldn't happen. And then in July, just 3 months before the attacks, a veteran analyst with Unit 8200, Israel's signals intelligence agency, warned that Hamas had conducted an intense day-long training exercise that appeared similar to what was outlined in the blueprint. But the same thing happened. A colonel in the Gaza division brushed off her concerns. And as we talked about in the October 7th episode, we had the Tatzpataniot, the young female surveillance soldiers tasked with watching the Gaza border. Just weeks before the brutal Hamas massacre on October 7th, they attempted to make the same warnings and were brushed off by their senior commanders. Do you see the pattern? A bit of cockiness. Ignoring people, quote unquote, below you. It's awful and depressing, but I do also need to highlight that while the military was slow, some heroes reacted incredibly quickly. There were soldiers and even retired soldiers like Amir T-Bone's father who moved through hell and high water to get to the front line to defend their people. Those people are heroes. And finally, it's just something that I believe, when Israel was going through the internal struggles that they were going through for months upon months upon months with the judicial reform debate within the country, again, Israel was quite vulnerable to attack. And Hassan Nasrallah, the former head of Hezbollah before he was assassinated, before he was killed, he actually said in the summer of 2023, Israel is at its most vulnerable, get ready to be attacked. That's something to consider as well. So those are some reasons that I think that this was able to happen. Those were the conditions under which it was able to happen. That combined with Hamas's genuinely genocidal approach to the state of Israel's existence led to the ability to do something like this. The next question comes from Stacia. And by the way, Stacia, I hope it's okay to say I love your name. No promises, but if I have another kid, Stacia shall be the name. Anyway, Stacia asked.
So I want to know why President Trump in 2017 was able to move the capital of Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. What gave him that authority? Is that true? Why did he do that? And what are the implications for Israelis today? Thanks for taking my question. Yalla.
So I want to start with an important clarification. President Trump didn't move the capital. He moved the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. But I get the question. That was me being annoying. So let's get into the history. First, this is probably obvious, but Jerusalem is pretty important to the Jewish people. Go back to 1000 BCE, King David originally established Jerusalem as the capital of the Israelite kingdom. Then David's son, Solomon, built the first holy temple there. That's all over Jewish tradition. That's like our story. After it was destroyed more than 400 years later, the second temple was subsequently rebuilt, standing for another 400 plus years in the same location. After the Romans destroyed the second temple in the year 70 CE, they exiled the Jews. Not cool, but the longing to return to Jerusalem was constantly in their hearts and on their lips. Jews pray towards Jerusalem. That's like where we pray towards. We sing songs about Jerusalem. We say over and over, next year in Jerusalem, not like Tel Aviv, Jerusalem. That wasn't me trying to say something nasty about Tel Aviv, my bad. But that's not what we say. It's Jerusalem. And in 1947, when the UN offered the partition plan, Israel wasn't offered Jerusalem, which was heartbreaking to many Zionists. Like Zion means in the direction of Jerusalem. Jerusalem and its surrounding area was officially designated as a corpus separatum, which meant that Jerusalem, considered holy to Jews, Muslims, and Christians, right? It's not just holy to the Jews, would have no sovereign affiliation to the proposed Jewish or Arab states. According to the UN Resolution 181, residents would automatically become citizens of the city of Jerusalem unless they would opt for citizenship of either the Jewish or Arab state. Although the Jews felt that any Jewish state should implicitly include Jerusalem, they accepted these terms because they would accept anything. They were desperate. While the Arabs rejected the entirety of the partition plans outright. They said no dice to the partition plan. You know what happened next. The Arabs attacked, Israel survived. It's more complicated than that. Listen to the 3-part series on 48. But Jerusalem ended up in Jordanian hands, where no Jews of any citizenship were allowed to visit. They couldn't go to the Western Wall, the Kotel. No good. And then almost 20 years later, in June 67, everything changed after Israel's victory in the Six-Day War. A united Jerusalem was now under Jewish rule for the first time since the Romans conquered it in the year 70. It's nuts. This was a major game changer for the Jewish people and the world. This has never happened. It's sui generis. And as Israeli soldiers set their flag high above their beloved Western Wall, the Wailing Wall, they felt as though they were joining the pantheon of Jewish heroes. King David, who conquered Jerusalem and turned it into his capital. Judah, the Maccabee, who purified the temple after its desecration by the Seleucids, not just the Greeks, that was so nerdy of me, and Bar Kokhba, who threw himself against the might of Rome in desperate battles for Zion and Jerusalem. Jerusalem was back in Jewish hands, and their capital was once again unified. So what changed? Well, some small things. For one, Israel headquartered its parliament and government offices in Jerusalem. And in 1980, Israel passed a basic law, which is kind of equivalent to a constitution. And this is what it said, quote, Jerusalem complete and united is the capital of Israel. There you have it. However, the UN wasn't impressed at all. They're like, okay, that's cute. Thanks, guys. Corpora separatum remained the official UN position. The UN condemned the basic law in Resolution 478 and has declared in numerous resolutions that changing the status of Jerusalem was illegal and therefore meaningless and has no validity. The UN. You and Israel can use some couples therapy. I got a guy. For the most part, the US and nearly all other Western countries placed their embassies in Tel Aviv to avoid conflict with the Arab countries and keep up a neutral stance without taking sides on final status issues, like Switzerland. Except even Switzerland's not really Switzerland. So on October 23rd, 1995, Congress under Bill Clinton passed the Advisory Jerusalem Embassy Act, stating that Jerusalem should be recognized as the capital of the State of Israel and the United States Embassy in Israel should be established in Jerusalem. Their argument was pretty simple. Each country could designate its own capital, okay? Jerusalem is where Israel's president is, where Israel's parliament and Supreme Court function, where the Israeli prime minister is. It also recognized that since 1967, Israel gave all religions full access to holy sites within the city and acknowledged that Jerusalem was the spiritual center of Judaism and like the cultural center, right? Becoming law in November of 1995, this act said that the relocation of the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem should be implemented no later than May 31st, 1999. I guess that happened, right? No, is that what happened? No, not at all. The Jerusalem Embassy Act contained a loophole, right? Allowing the presidential delay of the embassy move for 6 months in order to protect national security interests. And every president since 1995 signed the waiver every 6 months, each time stating that it was necessary to protect the national security interests of the United States. According to U.S. Ambassador to Israel Daniel Shapiro, it was to avoid igniting perhaps the most sensitive issue in the conflict. That's how they saw it. No sitting president ever pulled the trigger until President Donald Trump. In 2017, he announced that Jerusalem would finally be home to a U.S. embassy. Upon the announcement of the planned move, Trump echoed the sentiments of the 1995 act. He said, "It's time to officially recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. There's nothing more or less than a recognition of reality. It is also the right thing to do. It's something that has to be done." Embassy offices were established in Jerusalem as of May 2018 to coincide with Israel's 70th birthday. I remember how people said there would be an immediate violent reaction to it, but that did not happen. So that's the story of the embassy move. And let me just say this. It's clear that Israel and its people are appreciative of the show of friendship from the U.S. and from President Trump for this sort of move. But it doesn't change the fact that for Israel, Jerusalem was always the capital, no matter what anyone said, whether any president or government recognized it or not. Jerusalem has always been the capital of the Jewish people, not New York City. No jokes. Okay, and with that, let's get to our last question. This is from Rafi. Rafi asked,
Hello, Noam. I have a two-part question inspired by a recent episode of Unpacking Israeli History. As we all know, peace, like tangled, takes two partners. Who are the moderate peace-seeking voices in the Palestinian community today that we as diaspora Jews and Israelis committed to an eventual peaceful resolution can elevate and start bridge building with now, even in the midst of a war? The second question relates to anti-Israel protest movements in the West and why it differs so much from previous protest movements. Why does it seem like the only voices coming out of this so-called ceasefire movement are those that actively support Hamas and the destruction of Israel, and not those seeking a peaceful two-state solution? Previous protest movements, such as the anti-Vietnam and Iraq war protests, were explicitly anti-war at their core. Conversely, the messaging from these protests today are overtly and explicitly pro-war, calling for a violent end of the state of Israel with chants such as from the river to the sea and resistance by any means necessary, and advocating globalizing attacks on diaspora Jewish communities with chants such as globalize the Intifada. What is so different this time? Thank you.
Now, Rafi, this is a hard question, just like all the others, and I'll say it again. Listeners, keep them coming. We love the hard questions. Let's start with saying that it's important to consider who we are dealing with. There are different types of Palestinian experiences. There are Israeli Arab citizens of Israel. There's Gazan Palestinians who live under Hamas-controlled territory. There's West Bank Palestinians. There are Palestinians who are governed by the PA, Israeli military control. They're like all over. Palestinians outside of Israel, Palestinian territory like in America or Europe. And these groups are all massive and diverse. And yes, it's true, there does seem to be a depressing lack of moderation, at least amongst most Palestinian leaders. Consider the pay to slay. The program that gives a monthly allowance to the family of terrorists. This isn't from Hamas. This is from the Palestinian Authority. We also have senior Fatah officials who have justified October 7th as defensive war. And let's be honest, even some so-called moderates are tough to swallow. Marwan Barghouti is considered by many to be a moderate and argue he is best placed to assume Gaza leadership from Hamas. He's in Israeli prison, and Hamas is calling for his release from prison. Why is he there? Barghouti is serving 5 life sentences for his part in planning 3 terror attacks that killed 5 Israelis during the Second Intifada. So moderate is a weird word for a guy like that. But there are moderate voices, and I want to highlight some of them. You might not like them, you might love them, I don't know. But let's highlight them. Mansour Abbas, a Palestinian member of the Knesset, Israel's parliament. Abbas is an Islamist, a religious Muslim, who believes in working with Israel for the betterment of Arab Israelis. He believes that it is his mandate to work with the Jewish state, not against its existence. Note, this does not mean that I agree with much of what he says. But we're pragmatic, and we understand, and we learn, and we know that everyone's not like us. He's currently the leader of the United Arab List and represents the party in the Knesset. In 2021, Abbas made history by becoming the first Israeli Arab political leader to join an Israeli governing coalition under Naftali Bennett's leadership, like the religious Zionist. In a recent election, they won 5 seats in the Knesset, 193,916 votes, 4% of the total vote. That's a big deal. And he said courageous things. In December 2021, Abbas said that Israel was born as a Jewish state and will remain so, provoking outrage from members of other Arab parties. Now, again, you might be like, oh, you want a cookie for saying Israel should remain a Jewish state? The answer is yes. Give him a cookie. It's a big deal to go against many leaders in your community. You try to go against leaders in your community. See how that goes for you. I'm even afraid to start a second synagogue in my community. So it's really hard. And on February 10th, 2022, Abbas rejected Amnesty International's charge that Israel is an apartheid state, saying of Israel, I would not call it apartheid. Following the 2023 Hamas attack on Israel, Abbas urged unity between Jews and Arabs in Israel. He explicitly condemned the October 7th attack. He said last year that, quote, armed Palestinian factions need to stop using weapons and turn to a diplomatic project with the Palestinian Authority to strengthen the chances of a Palestinian state and announce an inclusive and permanent ceasefire to bring about peace and an end to Israeli-Palestinian conflict. By the way, if you were listening to this and thought I was talking about Mahmoud Abbas all the time, and I wasn't, I was talking about Mansour Abbas, different guys. There are other grassroots voices to look at. Maybe you've heard of Roots or Women Wage Peace or Hand in Hand or the Parent Circle, and I could go on and on and on. These groups bring together Palestinians and Israelis, leaders and civilians alike, to work together to find common ground and hopefully eventually bring peace to the region. Check out all of these groups to be inspired and to see real change. It's possible. If you believe it's possible, it's possible. If you don't believe it's possible, it's not possible. And lastly, I want to call out some individuals, like someone I recently interviewed, Samer Sinjalawi, a Palestinian activist and commentator. Samer believes in the power of empathy and maintains that the best way to ensure security for Israelis and dignity for Palestinians after the war is for their respective leaders to become friends, like real friends. You may also have heard of Mohammed Dajani Daoudi, who I've also been lucky enough to work with many times, and a person who I do not always see eye to eye with, but I deeply admire him. Here's his story. Dajani was born in 1946 to one of Jerusalem's historic Arab families. His parents were educated secular Muslims. His family fled to Egypt when Israel declared its independence in 1948, but returned to the old city of Jerusalem the following year, then under Jordanian rule, which you know. After years traveling America, earning multiple PhDs, which, by the way, overachiever, Dajani returned to Jerusalem, where his perspective of Israelis was challenged after seeing the medical treatment provided to his father and mother, respectively, by the Israelis. He was like, whoa, Palestinians are treated beautifully by Israelis in hospitals. Dajani joined the faculty of Al-Quds University in Jerusalem in 2001, but was forced to resign, sadly, in 2014 after leading a group of Palestinian students to Auschwitz, their first trip of its kind. In 2007, Tijani founded Wasatiyah, a movement to promote moderate Islam and interfaith dialogue, which he leads to this day. It's insulting to just name a couple because there are many, many more, many people like this. So I think Rafi was asking not only who are these people, but on a more basic level, do these people exist? Or are people who want peace and cooperation just shouting into a void? Is it like some Western imagination of people in the Middle East? So Rafi, I'm here to tell you it's not a void. There are people who are there. I have friends who are there, so don't lose hope. It's possible. Okay, that was a lot. That's all for this episode. Thank you all so much for joining us for our first ever Israel open mic. If you hated this, well, I'm really sorry. It's a huge bummer. And if you liked it, well, great news. More episodes are coming, and you can be a part of it. Send your questions and ideas to me, Noam at JewishUnpacked.com. Unpacking Israeli History is a production of Unpacked, a division of Open Door Media. Check out JewishUnpacked.com for everything Unpacked related. And one more time, write me at Noam at JewishUnpacked.com. This episode was produced by Rifki Stern. Our team for this episode includes the man, the myth, the legend, Hona Dodge, and Rob Pera, and Hanser Perez. I'm your host, Noam Weissman. Thanks for listening. See you next week.